InFamous, a trilogy of superhero games developed exclusively for the PlayStation 3 and 4, was created by Sucker Punch Productions from 2009 to 2015. Joining other major IPs under Sony's banner, they made their mark on both platforms thanks to focused design, engaging action, and the impact of player choice. How do they and their expansions hold up today? I'm about to find out. One more thing, a word of warning to viewers who may have motion sickness or epilepsy. The infamous games have a habit of violently shaking and flashing the screen during the in-game action, so bear that in mind. The Washington-based developer Sucker Punch could be considered a dark horse in the AAA gaming industry. They first rose to prominence on the PlayStation 2 with the Sly Cooper trilogy, a great series of games that stood tall in the system's trinity of 3D platformers. Some of the DNA from that franchise would find its way into the developer's next efforts. Making their way to the 7th generation was a steady process, as Infamous was first announced in 2007. If 2008 was the year the PlayStation 3 began to turn things around, then the following year was when it received its first wave of killer apps. Killzone 2 from Guerrilla Games and Uncharted 2 Among Thieves from Naughty Dog were both phenomenal titles that showcased the immense talent behind the brand. While these games drastically improved their respective franchises, Sucker Punch were making their debut after a longer incubation period. Neatly slotted into a May 2009 release, the game was a rousing success. It's been almost a decade since I last played Infamous. While originally I bought it on release, I would blast through it again when the PlayStation Network was hacked and Sony gave away 2 free titles as a consolation. There's a reason I chose Sucker Punch's superhero simulator. Despite its dated elements, the game remains a great exclusive, earning its place alongside others of the time. Infamous was also notable for giving players tickets to the Uncharted 2 multiplayer beta, which got the community massively excited for that game. So the title flashes up at the bottom of the screen, a simple city background laid out before you. You hit the start button and... boom, you're right into the game. No need for menus or game loading. It's all so seamless and efficient. Not many games at the time pulled you in so quickly. Even when you load a save, the game only requires one bout of loading. With no separate interiors to speak of, Infamous keeps you fully enveloped in its setting, getting off to a great start as a result. Sure, there's a time for slowly easing the player into your world and building a tone, but the opening to Infamous mirrors how its events are set in motion, a sudden horrific disaster that consumes Empire City in its entirety. After a single breadcrumb is planted, we wake up with Cole McGrath, voiced by Jason Kosel, at the centre of the explosion, witnessing the same devastation he does as the game gets the player used to the controls. It's a straightforward tutorial, one that establishes both the chaos of the setting and the protagonist's rise. As the setting plunges into an abyss of crime and suffering, the title begins in earnest. The Neon District serves as the game's first act, and Infamous wastes no time in making its mechanics known. The second mission, First Glimpse, sees Cole and his best friend Zeke head to Archer Square, where the game smoothly transitions between its 3 main features: platforming, combat, and finally making choices at specific intervals. It's a great way to ease the player into the title, and it continues as Cole's first choice emerges. Either you can let the civilians take the food supplies airdropped in, or scare them off and take it all for yourself, with appropriate reactions from Cole's girlfriend Trish afterwards. I chose the good path for Infamous 1, as this way is viewed as canon. With its characters and systems established, Infamous marks itself as a very structured and concentrated affair, with both its gameplay and design closely tied to the game world. It's a stark contrast to its biggest competitor at the time, Prototype, which focused more on letting players go on a wild rampage. There's a gradual build-up of powers, enemies, and locations as Cole looks to master his new abilities and find out who caused the explosion. In essence, a playthrough will follow a straight path of main missions, with side missions for good and evil on either side. Its three main gameplay facets are all very well fleshed out, and I'll start with the combat. It's a more free-flowing third-person shooter with occasional cover-based action involving a wide range of electrical attacks. Essentially, these are archetypes of various ballistic weapons, but unlike other uninspired titles which fail to tie these in with their universe, InFamous works to distance itself from the feel of its contemporaries. The basic lightning bolt is effectively a semi-automatic pistol, and you'll eventually fill in slots for a shotgun, grenades, a sniper, and rocket launcher as the game goes on. There's also a crunchy, free-punch combo that Cole can use in close quarters which gets the job done. What impresses me the most about Cole's powers in the original InFamous is how they're all equally useful throughout the game, with unique upgrades that add to their effectiveness. With evasive rolls and the ability to drain electrical objects to replenish your ammo and health, it's an easy system to engage with, and taking on foes, finding items in the game world, and performing various power stunts showers Cole with experience points that can be used for upgrades. For example, the version of the shockwave I got as good Cole sees enemies float through the air, making them easier to hit. As these foes grow stronger, you're encouraged to put Cole's more advanced abilities to work. Later factions can tank more energy blasts in this case, but combat always remains engaging. It can be quite challenging on hard as Cole's attackers are highly aggressive. In addition to the base troops firing from the rooftops, you've got more imaginative mini-bosses that the game refers to as conduits. These guys also obtain powers from the Ray Sphere Blast and should be prioritised in battles, from the Reaper Lieutenants to the massive junk golems. Combat goes hand in hand with traversal, which allows Cole to attack or drain energy from just about any angle. Many games before and after InFamous relied on a very precise platforming system, or augmented their climbing with various gadgets. Sucker Punch's title instead opts for a simple and intuitive route. The player only needs to keep tapping X and Cole will scale buildings with ease, magnetically attaching to each handhold and with great animations to boot. Once you unlock the induction grind and static thruster abilities, the speed you can get across the city accelerates. Forget about Slipknot from the DC universe, Cole McGrath is the man who can climb anything. It fits in effortlessly with the combat, encouraging the player to remain on the move. Generally, it's good to have a height advantage for taking on enemies, and InFamous consistently facilitates freedom of movement. Also aiding this component is Cole's pulse sensor. With a click of the left stick, you can easily uncover blast shards and dead drops located nearby, which ensures that navigation never becomes an issue. There's enough differences between the building architecture to set the three areas apart. The only issue that arises is when you need to land on a specific ledge to snag a blast shard. It can be a bit fiddly at times. Precision is a difficult thing to get right when giving players freedom of movement, and when you're attempting to latch onto a specific handhold, other points can get in the way. At other times, Cole can get stuck underneath a small roof or other obstacle when clambering up, resulting in some delays. It isn't enough to break the overall pacing, however. Finally, we have the karma system. Many would argue that this aspect of the series has aged the most poorly, mostly for its binary representation of good and evil with no grey area in between. It's a system that wouldn't fit well in today's gaming landscape, and if InFamous had been a full-blown RPG like Mass Effect, this criticism would have carried a greater sway. As it stands though, the choices Cole makes are brilliantly woven into the design, directly impacting the world and the protagonist's own development. There are three main ranks on each side which also tie in with power upgrades: Guardian, Champion and Hero for good, Thug, Outlaw and Infamous for evil. Each game in the InFamous series sees this build up in varying ways. In this title, reaching the next rank is locked off until a particular milestone is reached, keeping things in balance and ensuring Cole doesn't grow too powerful too quickly. All three mainline games in the series market themselves as offering 2 full playthroughs, and it undoubtedly succeeds. Whenever a choice comes into play, the action pauses and the protagonist considers his options, leaving the player to decide the outcome. It's a great method of presentation that really gets you into character, returning control to the player and allowing them to command what happens. Around halfway through the first act, Cole must choose between taking multiple hits for civilians or forcing a toxic chemical into the water system and making more people sick. This incorporates both gameplay and the karma system in a simple yet effective way. At one point I attempted to blast the toxic tank off without getting a face full of poison, but the mission bugged out and wouldn't proceed, which prompted a reload. Cole may be a gravelly and gruff renegade throughout the title, but you'll still be invested in his journey, and the choices slowly mould him into a defined identity. Good Cole is mostly concerned about getting him and his close companions out of Empire City at first, but he slowly grows more responsible for the entire populace. Likewise, Evil Cole appears to act in aid of his friends, but grows more and more selfish as things go on. The two paths he can take are clearly displayed through the city's outlook, the way civilians react to you, and alterations to dialogue as you go through. These little touches may not look like much, but they enhance the believability of the narrative. On top of all this, you've also got the touch actions, which allow Cole to express his attitude towards Empire City on a more intimate level. He can heal wounded pedestrians and tie down enemies without killing them for good karma, or suck the life right out of them for evil karma. The player is encouraged, not forced to go down one path, and this will bring specific benefits, most notably with how Cole's powers develop. In short, good allows you to be more precise, while evil opts for greater chaos. The unique powers Overload Burst and the Emperor Palpatine style Arc Lightning can only be unlocked through reaching good or bad side mission milestones, the content of which reflects the route you've chosen. That brings me to the story itself, which unfolds over the course of 3 weeks. It's told through 3 methods: on-the-fly conversations that provide brief snippets about the characters' backstories, dead drops from the elusive John White that reveal background detail, and finally animated cutscenes that bookend the story's key moments. The latter is certainly the most impactful. Sucker Punch were already well versed in this with their previous IP, and by taking on a graphic novel aesthetic, the adult-oriented nature of the tale is emphasized, alongside enriching the characters and their motives. It's very much like the works of Alan Moore and Tim Miller in this regard. With that said, the other storytelling methods don't fare quite as well. In fact, that's something that can be said for much of Infamous's presentation. The colour palette is washed out, the animations are very stiff, and the frame rate is a little inconsistent. Graphical detail wasn't a focus for the original title, and while it doesn't impact the gameplay itself, this element is the most dated aspect of the title. There is one redeeming quality, and that's the audio design. Voice acting is spot on from everyone involved, the lightning blasts sound powerful, and the soundtrack is appropriately moody all the way through. When Empire City is placed under quarantine and Cole attempts to escape, the game's main goal is laid out. Agent Moyer of the FBI tasks him with finding the Ray Sphere, a device that gave Cole his powers. It becomes the main MacGuffin, one that the protagonist delivered as a courier in the game's opening, and also an elusive item that just about everyone wants. As a central crux of the story, all the characters' lives revolve around it. This fuels much of the drama, and in a way, many of the characters represent different foils for Cole's choices. His girlfriend Trish, voiced by October Moore, is initially hostile, believing he killed her sister, though as a medic, she represents the virtuous side of the story. On the other hand, Cole's best friend Zeke falls somewhere in the middle, being both a selfish arsehole one moment, and doing his best to assist the next. By the time the game reaches the third act, Zeke represents quite the paradox. He makes such calamitous, horrendous mistakes, and yet he's also Cole's only friend in the crumbling city. My personal issue with him is that he overshadows other characters like Trish throughout the game, constantly chiming in after side missions with repetitive quips. On the other hand, however, the game's villains are a little weak in terms of development. Sasha, for example, reflects Cole's dark side, acting as a source of temptation throughout the game. It's said that she's had a previous history with him, though this is mostly left to the background as we don't learn much about what she was up to before she became superpowered. Choices are also layered throughout the title, some critical, others more incidental. One of the early dilemmas involves an associate of Moya's who refuses to open a door in the sewers. You can either tell him his wife is dead or fry him and put him out of his misery, although there's nothing stopping the player from doing the latter after opting for the good path. Another crucial moment comes when a poster designer asks Cole how he would like to be perceived. The way these are arranged throughout the game adds to the story, showing how Cole is slowly but surely building a reputation around the city. Other choices are more simple. Do you cut down a strung-up thief or leave him to rot? Do you help the civilian or steal their blast shards right away? These points have a lesser impact on your karma score and mostly work to fill in the gaps between the main story objectives. It's also told at a reasonable pace across both main and side missions, distinguished by their blue and yellow markers. Looking at the map, there's 3 districts with one gang and a leader in charge of each. The Neon District ran by the Reapers with Sasha as their leader, the Warrens with the Dustmen owned by Alden, and finally the Historical District with the First Sons controlled by Kessler. They lay the groundwork for the missions themselves. Typically, you'll start by entering the sewers to power up each section, which both gives Cole a new power alongside a playground for him to test it out before returning to the streets. On occasion, however, the set pieces do heat up, creating more action-packed scenarios. Getting the district trains running again and escorting Trish's medical bus through the Warrens are particular highlights. Each act ends with a boss fight, all of which are well suited to the villain's aesthetics. Cole fights Sasha in a dimly lit tunnel loaded with hallucinogenic liquid, making for a claustrophobic encounter. The side quests are more tried and true. Simple race challenges, scavenger hunts, tailing enemies for blast shards, they do get a little repetitive after a while. The side missions aren't all that inventive and are often completed very quickly, but in terms of tying into the narrative, there's still an interesting build-up at play. For example, in the first act, you'll see the Reapers taking hostages and transporting poison in trucks. Then, they start pumping that same poison into the water supply. These side quests carry a build-up into Dinner with Sasha, where Cole learns the full story behind the Reaper occupation. Those people you rescued earlier were going to be taken to the tunnel to be converted into new soldiers, and the poison water in the towers made them more susceptible to indoctrination. At other points, the game goes into overdrive, putting Cole in the middle of massive battles between 2 gangs, which are certainly the highlights of the side quests. In keeping with the game's karma system, the 15 side quests for good or evil Cole strike the biggest contrast. These fall in line with the game's power variations, as good missions involve working with the Empire City Police, while evil sees Cole briefly team up with Sasha and other unsavory individuals. One side escorts prisoners to jail, the other causes destruction. You get the idea. Once Cole reaches the poverty-stricken Warrens, he starts to take on the Dustmen, a clan of thugs who appear to worship junk. It takes some time for this story thread to build, as their leader doesn't come to light until the latter half of the second act. The man in question is Alden, a powerful mentalist and former leader of the First Sons, who was cast out onto the streets by Kessler. Despite his potential and intriguing backstory, he's the weakest character in the game. He only has a few spoken lines, and despite his apparently massive mental powers, he rarely uses them to his advantage, instead choosing to throw his junk monsters at Cole instead. Alden should have played a greater role in the second act, complicating Cole's efforts to take over the district, rather than have his subordinates do it for him. One highlight comes when Cole ventures into a fortified container park to rescue Zeke, which forces the player to be mindful of enemies round corners and up above. It's at this point that Zeke lashes out, his jealousy towards Cole's powers showing beneath his desire to help. It's followed up later by arguably the game's best mission, where Cole climbs the highest tower in the city to confront Alden and steal the Ray Sphere. Gazing out over the ruined city and taking on a challenging fight at the summit is one of the game's most memorable moments, which also sets up another narrative swerve. Zeke grabs the Ray Sphere and runs away with Kessler, his selfish desire to become superpowered overcoming his friendship with the protagonist. Right after that, you head across the bridge and take on Alden's boss fight. The fight may be visually impressive, but it's still an anticlimactic end to Alden's story arc, as the old man jumps off into the water, never to be seen again for the rest of the game series. It's also around this point in the game that we find John White, who denies all knowledge of Moya and clues Cole into the FBI's real plans. Much like Alden though, John doesn't make much of an impression, being off screen most of the time and not revealing much that hasn't already been told through his dead drop recordings. You'll notice that the game goes in both a narrative and literal full circle. At the opening of the game, Cole crosses the Southern Bridge to leave the historical district at the game's opening, then gradually works his way around all three of Empire City's districts. The third act begins with a bang as Cole's arrival to the historical district features both a drastic difficulty spike and a heart-wrenching loss. Taking the First Sons head-on, you're immediately thrown in at the deep end as Trish is taken captive by Kessler. The choice he gives to Cole is a nasty one. Save Trish or save her medical colleagues who can help more people. No matter which way you choose, Cole's girlfriend plunges to her death. And playing as good Cole, it's a genuinely sad moment that brings to mind the Dark Knight from the previous year. Though on replaying, I found myself wishing for a couple of extra scenes between the two of them, as we don't really hear from Trish after the rescue at the hospital. Something that would reinforce their bond before tearing it apart. Perhaps some of Zeke's lines after side missions could have been replaced. It's also here that you receive Cole's final and most devastating power, the Lightning Storm. Acting as a screen nuke, it's incredibly satisfying to unleash hell on the First Sons, and eventually Cole and John team up to finally track down the Ray Sphere. As an experiment, I ran through this penultimate mission twice to test the Karma system. Choosing to use the Ray Sphere is an act considered so sadistic that it drops your level all the way to InFamous rank, even if you're maxed out as hero. This caused a different statement. Evil act tarnishes your good reputation. As binary as the morality in InFamous is, it's good that Sucker Punch accounted for these shifts and didn't force players down one path for later decisions. The final confrontation unfolds immediately afterwards, right where it all started as Kessler offers one more test for Cole to overcome. With the widest range of attacks and the opening music cue backing it, InFamous's conclusion is suitably climactic, but it's the story's final twist that hammers it home. Throughout the game, Sasha and Alden made some comments about Cole personally, suggesting they know more about him than they're letting on, alongside Kessler's comments during the boss battle. Once defeated, Kessler uses the last of his strength to latch on to Cole and deliver his last shocking revelation. The central villain watching over Armor Graf through the whole game is actually an older version of himself who went back in time. It's a powerful scene that recontextualizes Kessler's entire motive, bringing to mind the likes of Knights of the Old Republic and Bioshock Infinite. He wished to change the apocalyptic future he failed to prevent, brought on by a beast of untold power. Kessler's grief and shame was so great that he decided to murder Trish to force Cole to change his ways. The foreshadowing throughout the game, alongside much of the villainous activities that unfolded, is very well layered to deliver the story's finale. The epilogue, from the perspective of a good outcome, leaves Cole in a lonely place with Zeke and Moya merely vanishing. Despite the city loving him, he ponders over where he will go and how things will change. With this excellent ending in place and a winning formula established, Sucker Punch had laid a rock-solid foundation for the next entry in the franchise. Following a Dark Horse comic that revealed the fates of Moya, Alden, and Sasha to an extent, Sucker Punch started working on InFamous 2, which also arrived in the middle of the year in 2011. Sucker Punch went in looking to improve every aspect of the original title, and eager to see where the story would go, I bought the game at launch, enjoying it well enough at first. Yet, since getting all the trophies, I've never gone back for another playthrough until now. Like the first InFamous, there's a reason for that as well. I just couldn't get into InFamous 2 nearly as much. Yet, when I went back to replaying it for this retrospective, I found myself enjoying it a lot more. InFamous 2 is a more iterative sequel that continues on its predecessor's solid first outing. It's certainly very similar to the original, but the one major claim to fame is its user-generated content. Clearly inspired by Media Molecule's Little Big Planet 2 from the year before, InFamous 2 allows for mission creation with a wide range of tools and components at your disposal. It's surprisingly intuitive once you wrap your head around it, and there are still users leaving reviews 9 years later. I once attempted to make a mission about a monster attack on a fort occupied by LaRoche around halfway through the game. With that out of the way, let's get to the title itself. Maintaining the seamless loading and non-existent menus of the first game, InFamous 2 opens up with a choice. You can opt to continue your good or evil karma playthrough or start a completely new game on neutral. I had the wrong expectations of this screen back in 2011. This isn't Mass Effect 2 where your choices are constantly referenced and woven into the game. Instead, the game reads your PS3 trophy set and gives you bonuses on a new game, including free XP points, starting at the first karma rank on either side, and battery cores to up your ammo count from the get-go. The game's actual opening kicks off in Empire City around a month after the original game's events. It uses the good ending as canon and sees the returning Colin Zeke teaming up with NSA agent Lucy Quo, voiced by Dawn Olivieri. Things feel rather rushed to say the least, as Quo is quickly thrown in without much background. The same issue also shows with the Beast, who appears far earlier than Cole and his friends anticipated. It's a rough fight, and the protagonist ultimately loses, as the Beast drains some of his power and destroys Empire City. This place you spent hours protecting in the previous game is abruptly cut off, which I feel was a bad direction to take. A couple of opening missions could have seen Cole go around a small portion of the city, as the citizens react to him based on his karma from the previous game. It would have delivered a smoother return to the franchise, while also creating a firmer bridge between the two narratives. Once Cole does flee the city by boat, however, we're quickly introduced to New Marais, a settlement heavily inspired by New Orleans. The first thing you'll notice about the place is how much more vibrant and colourful it looks. Empire City was grey and monochrome. New Marais is brighter and more varied, from the neon hub in the middle of the first district all the way out to the surrounding swamps. Some remnants of the American South play a role in the area, such as rundown plantations and the circling tram lines, making the location very distinctive from the previous title. Character animations have seen a major upgrade thanks to the use of motion capture, and a slew of audio effects give stronger feedback to the gameplay. After an initially controversial redesign, Eric Ladin was brought in to replace Jason Cottle as Cole. Ladin does a good job of expanding on Cole's character, ditching his gruff persona for a more varied script. From the perspective of a good playthrough, he's caring but also a little cocky at times, making him more well-rounded in general. It's clear from the get-go that the biggest step forward InFamous 2 takes is through its technical presentation. On top of these aesthetic improvements, there's also a small implementation of destructible environments, as Cole can take out scaffolding or oil works for some added destruction. The soundtrack is also just as strong as the first game, adding more of a punch to the action sequences. With the Beast making its way down the eastern seaboard, Cole, Zeke and Quo link up with Dr. Sebastian Wolf, an unwilling associate of Kessler, to collect blast cores and power the protagonist up before his nemesis arrives. It's all about using Wolf's ray field inhibitor, or RFI for short. This progression is the central point of the story, as every time you boot up the title, the game lets you know how far the Beast is from New Marais, while also informing how many blast cores are left to be absorbed. At first, Cole and his compatriots infiltrate a rally to investigate Joseph Bertrand, a nefarious corporate mogul who has seized control of New Marais' main district in response to the Empire event. Between Joseph's bigoted pride and the large militia at his back, InFamous 2 gets across through gameplay that these guys aren't pushovers. Dr. Wolf is captured, albeit off-screen, and as Cole, Zeke and Quo attempt to rescue him, disaster strikes as they're rammed off the road. It's a dark turn that highlights Cole's initial struggle in this new city, but it also tosses Dr. Wolf aside as an expendable character, leaving his collectible dead drops to pick up the pieces. Wolf's untimely demise could have been saved for later, allowing him to fill Cole in on the greater conspiracies behind the conduits. The voice acting from Michael Ensign is still strong, however, as the returning collectibles now require you to knock down flying pigeons and collect their recordings. Marking itself as an easily accessible sequel for fans and featuring most of the same powers from the first game, Infamous 2 instead seeks to create multiple versions of the tools Cole has at his disposal, which split off into good and evil variants. You'll have to wait for entirely new powers to show up, but the differing ways you can use existing ones are a welcome addition, and you can easily swap between them with a pop-out menu mapped to the D-pad. For the good side, I unlocked Pincer Bolt at Karma level 2, which is good for headshots, and at level 3 Cole received Bolt Stream, a highly useful machine gun that keeps enemies pinned down despite its lower damage. Other abilities further expand Cole's options, most notably the Kinetic Pulse, which allows him to lift and toss cars for an explosive surprise. It works very well when the cars aren't getting caught on parts of the geography. On top of the base moves, Infamous 2 also features devastating ionic powers, with my most used being the Tornado. As super attacks, these feel incredibly satisfying to use. Other powers end up feeling like afterthoughts, however. Making the Sticky Bomb an unlockable power when it could do that without upgrades in the first Infamous comes off as lackluster. There are also some powers that aren't so useful. The car jump doesn't get used much aside from reaching induction lines, and the Frost Shield, in addition to covering a smaller area than its predecessor, zooms the camera into an unclear level. Speaking of ice powers, the game's midway point sees Cole given a critical gameplay decision. Does he gain the precision-based ice powers from Quo, or the destructive fire strikes from Nyx? The device that allows the trio to swap powers feels a bit convenient, but it's the additions to gameplay that count. Aiding in both traversal and combat, this choice adds a large flair to the combat, infusing Cole's existing powers with an elemental twist. There are also a couple of unique abilities on each side. Nyx gives Firebird Strike, a dash move that can be used to traverse gaps, and Quo delivers Ice Spike, which launches Cole into the air for an excellent combination with the existing static thrusters. You'll certainly need them, as the game's second act takes Cole to the flooded district with a new enemy in tow. These ice soldiers were being experimented on at the same time as Quo, and are big fans of leaping around the environment. Combining these new foes with the water-based environments allows for a change of pace, as the area is littered with pools just waiting to be electrified. It's also at this point that Bertrand's character expands as we unearth his dirty little secret. He is, in fact, a monster himself, and also responsible for killing Nyx's family. This is peak hypocrisy to his militia-focused rule, and while it has little to do with the RFI or the Beast, this character moment is well delivered. This location also sees the mission design branch out into its most inventive. Frying monsters with Zeke's light beams to escort civilians is satisfying, and in several instances, you're using Cole's kinetic pulse to move and toss items around the environment, like this moment where you're plugging oil wells poisoning the air. Rather than keep enemy introductions to their individual factions, new foes are thrown at Cole throughout the game, often appearing abruptly towards the end of missions. There are quite a few enemy classes with a range of offensive powers. There's a small change that makes a big impact in Infamous 2, specifically its mini-bosses. From charging monsters to hulking ice giants, they're a challenge to take on, but I always found the addition of health bars an odd choice. For starters, they can only be damaged by special attacks, with the regular lightning bolt regulated to foot soldiers. It does cut down on spamming the same standard attacks, but it also knocks the pacing of combat a bit. You'll be doing more running around and recharging this time, while also waiting for these enemies to show you their weak points. It can take time to whittle down their strength, and the unskippable animations that play on their defeat get a little tiresome. Another thing I never liked about Infamous 2's combat was the violent and jerky camera. Whenever Cole gets knocked back, the camera seems to snap backwards into a corner, leaving you disoriented for a brief moment. Given how this happens frequently during mini-boss encounters, it doesn't do them any favours. I noticed there were more cheap deaths in Infamous 2, mostly down to how these creatures unleash a barrage of projectiles that are tough to dodge at times. I once again played on hard mode, and I found myself knocked out of combat far more quickly than before. At times, this increase in difficulty felt artificial. Finally, we have the expanded melee system, this time focusing on the amp, which our protagonist focuses his electricity into. In the original game, Cole had a simple combo of punches. Apart from moments where you missed your target, it was quick, simple, and efficient. In theory, the amp is a major upgrade, but it has a couple of problems. It's satisfying to chain attacks together and land a dazzling finishing move, refilling your energy in the process, but the first issue lies with only allowing Cole to attack one enemy at a time. With a higher concentration of close-range attackers, you'll dive into the crowd, only to be knocked backwards. Sucker Punch needed to take inspiration from their previous efforts here. Back in Slide 2 and 3, there were many different cane attacks to use, all mapped to the face buttons: push, jump, and spin. Tapping circle and triangle gets a bit samey after a while, and the amp is also useless against mini-bosses. Upgrades do help the weapon to maintain its edge, allowing Cole to rack up combos more quickly, but you end up with a melee system that leaves a bit to be desired. The karma system also remains intact, though notably you can grind your way all the way up to hero or infamous rank without needing to meet mission requirements first. There are some elements I disagree with, however. Often the karmic choices involve going to mission start points, rather than have Cole interact directly in the moment. You can go to Kuo's start point for the good path, or Nyx's for evil, with the former involving a broader effort on teamwork and the latter homing in on deceitful trickery. This dampens Cole's agency a bit, as he no longer reflects on the choices before him and instead appears to go along with who he agrees with most. It's neat to hear characters voice their disapproval as you get close to one side over another, but there could have been a moment before Cole sets out where he ponders the options given to him. As a result, this change sees some story missions split off into good and evil approaches before returning to the central story progression afterwards, and in doing so takes a step beyond the specific side quests in the first game. One chain of side quests sees Cole and Kuo team up with an ice soldier defector who helps you out in battle, but as the game goes on, he starts to evolve into larger forms, his sanity withering away, which forces Cole to put his ally down in the final act. These contained stories do a good job of adding to the main plot at specific points. On the other side of the coin, you have various karmic events marked on the minimap which allow Cole to express his good or evil side outside of missions. These consolidated activities include healing civilians and stopping muggings for good, and taking out police officers and street performers for evil, giving you a boost of karma and a pat on the back from the appropriate character. Making the world feel more alive in this way is a worthy idea, but they do have their limitations. Many of the side missions often fall back on these samey objectives, which rarely change throughout the game. In addition, once you've maxed out your karmic level, there isn't much reason to carry them out aside from a quick XP boost. Disarming bombs or stealing off civilians is a useful way of gathering the returning blast shards, but it's a shame the other events aren't as well integrated. Moving along the main narrative, Infamous 2's story has expanded to a broader level, but this brings with it some problems, the most notable of which being a lack of balance between the characters. LaRoche, a rebel leader who stands up to the militia, and Nyx in particular, are off-screen for quite a while, their appearances limited to brief radio conversations. The villains still have their issues too. Bertrand's role in the story is put aside after Cole first encounters him, and on the whole, the militia mostly serve as a batch of enemies to fight, rather than a well-defined faction. In the first act, there could have been more detail showing how Bertrand brought them on side. In the first game, the villains were a little shallow, but they made up for that somewhat by fitting into the central narrative. Sasha was the source of Kessler's mind control scheme, and Alden drove a wedge between the main antagonist and Cole himself. Here, we have characters moving on and off screen at frequent intervals, which limits the impact they have on the plot. It's a shame, as the characteristics of the main cast are much more well defined. For starters, the returning Zeke, once again voiced by Caleb Moody, has learned from his mistakes and has become more virtuous, lending a big help to his best pal throughout the game. Cole's animosity towards him at the game's opening feels a bit limited, considering how he effectively got Trish killed, but by the end you believe in their friendship. Following its opposite-based structure, Kuo and Nyx's unique characteristics cause them to frequently butt heads throughout the story. The former is calmer and more controlled, but still struggling to get to grips with being forced into becoming a conduit. The latter is mostly burning with anger and mayhem, looking to take swift revenge on those who killed her family decades earlier. The animated cutscenes that bookend the two women are very well presented, as they show the differing traumas they went through, while also showing what drives them to work alongside Cole. The good and evil missions see them teaming up with our protagonist, and their unique abilities come into play as they stun enemies for the player to take down instantly. Even if the story remains unbalanced, the presence of these two is still felt during gameplay. Moving into a small industrial district for the third act also falls in line with the original, but as Infamous 2's ending draws near, the powers given to Cole are a bit questionable. First up is the lightning tether. Serving as a grappling hook, it allows our hero to scale any building instantly, provided it's in range. It's useful to an extent, but it removes the need for climbing and also has no use in combat. Perhaps the tether could have pulled Cole towards enemies so he could engage them with the amp. Finally, we have another returning power with the lightning storm, this time an ionic power. It's unfortunate that by the time this devastating ability makes an appearance, the game is nearly over and you won't find many areas to use it. It's around this point that we come to the big twist, that John White, seemingly killed when Cole destroyed the ray sphere in Empire City, has become the Beast. It's an admirable idea given how the events of the original Infamous altered the timeline, but this is easily the weakest moment in the story. Let me explain. For starters, John was already an underdeveloped character back in the first game, so right from the word go, he's less impactful. 2. The presentation of the moment is lackluster, appearing seemingly out of nowhere in-game. This is a scene that should have had a rendered cutscene to add more weight to John's appearance. Finally, his arrival is pushed to the closing missions of the game, leaving little time for the character to make an impression. What John does do is set up the story's final choice. The Beast is not intent on absolute destruction as he was with Kessler. Instead, he is activating conduits throughout America, giving them powers while also curing them of the plague. It's an interesting turn of events, but with its weak presentation, it lacks the impact it should have. After this plot point is introduced, John mostly talks to Cole telepathically and isn't seen again until the finale, which effectively comes down to 3 strikes. Cole, Quo, Nix and LaRoche all team up to bring down Bertrand in his monster form at first, which makes for a good boss encounter, even if it's mostly the same one you fought earlier in the game, just with a more extravagant set piece. This is followed up by a fairly standard final conflict with the Icemen, as they hold one more blast core atop their ice tower. The game would have you believe the ice soldiers have been building to this point for some time, but from a story standpoint it's fairly hollow as we never really learn what these enemies wanted since breaking out of their cells. With 2 factions knocked out, that just leaves the Beast itself, which brings us to Cole's final decision. It turns out the RFI kills all conduits and not just the Beast, which causes Quo and Nix to suddenly trade places. Nix, wanting revenge on the Beast, represents the good ending, while Quo, afraid of death, now wishes to side with the Beast and betray humanity. On my first playthrough, I didn't like this 180 turn. It felt abrupt and some details were missing. Nix's monster takeover, for example, was done off-screen, making it more difficult to empathise with her losses. An additional mission where Cole heads back to the swamps with her would have provided more context while also bringing her character full circle, the monsters becoming her new family. Perhaps some of them could have joined the fight against Bertrand in his final moments. Working through the final choice again, however, it does definitely have its impact. Quo was established earlier as being unsure of her new powers, and it would make sense that out of fear she would make an irrational decision under pressure. Either way, the Beast needs to die, but how you go about it plays out in 2 different ways. The evil ending sees Cole murder Nix and even his best friend Zeke, making for a suitably grim conclusion as the protagonist takes up the Beast's mantle himself. In the first game, Cole's choices determine the fate of Empire City alone. In Infamous 2, this one decision influences the fates of all superpowered individuals, a drastic increase in scale. The action is suitably intense as LaRoche's men take Cole and Nix into battle, only to end up sacrificing themselves to slow the Beast down. The leader and his men may not be the most developed characters, but they still went out with a bang. Taking on the Beast itself is much like the game's opening, only this time more explosive and climactic. Things come to a head as Cole takes hold of the RFI, the Beast on his knees nearby. It's a great context-sensitive moment as the player holds all 4 triggers and one more objective appears. Let go. Let go of Cole's powers, his choices, his life, so that humanity can live. The activation of the RFI reverberates around the world, with countless conduits losing their lives. But with the passing of the plague, humanity is left to rebuild. On a thematic level, Infamous 2 doesn't boast the grand twist of the original, but on an interactive standpoint, the ending is a powerful one. As Zeke leaves New Marais with Cole's body, it's a very bittersweet close for his Good Karma storyline, something only heightened by the reflective piano piece that plays over the end credits. Infamous 2 may have its problems, but it successfully matches the quality of its predecessor, something that my 15-year-old self dismissed back in the game's heyday. While it appeared to be a definitive end to the series, Infamous would make its way to PlayStation 4 3 years later, but after 2 came Sucker Punch's first standalone expansion. Released just 4 months after its source material, I was debating whether to include Infamous Festival of Blood in this retrospective. It's a spin-off from the main story, and bafflingly enough, it's still being sold at full price on the PlayStation Network. In the end, I went for it. I'd never played the expansion before and wanted to analyse the franchise fully, though I'll keep it brief. What we get is a mildly entertaining but otherwise mediocre 2 hours of B-movie schlock that ranks as the weakest entry in the series. It's very much like Red Dead Redemption's Undead Nightmare DLC, applying the horror genre over the base game. Taking place on a dark and booze-filled pyre night, Cole enters the catacombs beneath New Marais, only to find himself an unwilling participant in the awakening of Bloody Mary, using his conduit blood. Set to become Mary's indoctrinated servant by sunrise, it's up to Cole and Zeke to kill off the Elder Vampire, accompanied by a small set of animated cutscenes and some basic glyphs that lay out Mary's past. The story knows exactly what it is and doesn't overblow it. Even the opening with Zeke chatting up a girl at a bar, he could easily be making the story up in context. It doesn't take itself too seriously. The grim atmosphere of the action would fit right in with a Halloween anthology series, and while there's only one new environment introduced, the presentation remains on par with the base game. The same can't be said for the enemies, however, who mostly stick to jumping around and clinging to walls. Outside of the demonic firstborn vampires, it isn't all that imaginative, and the same holds true for the core action. For the standalone DLC, the XP system, Karma, and upgrades are all dropped in favour of Cole's onset of vampirism. The anti-hero can now drink the blood of oblivious bystanders and claim a reduced set of upgrades to his existing electric powers. Ideally, this should open the door to a new range of abilities, but with most of them recycled from the evil Karma side of Infamous 2, there's only a couple that match up to this potential. Cole picks up a wooden stake to replace the amp for disintegrating enemies, and more notably can turn into a swarm of bats to fly around. As the pack's most unique feature, there's a certain novelty to flying around the city, and in the latter half of the DLC, it's used to good effect in the chase sequence. It's too bad the finale itself relies on a lackluster wave defense sequence rather than an actual boss fight. The smaller scale nature of its development may have allowed Sucker Punch to branch out a bit, but 9 years after its release, Festival of Blood doesn't have much ground to stand on. It's an interesting experiment and little more, not worth its £9 price tag. Following a brand update, Sucker Punch would start gearing up for the 4th PlayStation. When the PS4 first started out, one of the first major exclusives announced was Infamous Second Son. Unlike the previous generation, the game was placed front and centre in Sony's marketing, aiming to act as a key system seller for the console's opening lineup. In reality, Second Son would arrive in March 2014, providing one of the first heavy hitters of an initially slow 8th generation. With the likes of Knack and the Order 1886 falling by the wayside, more pressure was piled on the third Infamous game to deliver. I didn't own a PS4 when Infamous Second Son came out, and bought both the base game and its expansion First Light recently for this retrospective. Both halves of the package were hailed as some of the better experiences for the PlayStation 4 before things really kicked in 2015, even if they ended up feeling weaker than the PS3 originals. Having played it all the way through, reaching 100% completion, I believe it takes good steps forward in gameplay and presentation, but ends up stagnating in story and overall design. It also repeats some mistakes from its predecessor. For this release, I switched things up and embarked on an evil playthrough. Leaving behind its world-ending stakes and taking place in the real-life city of Seattle, Infamous Second Son takes place 7 years after the events of Infamous 2, and once again uses the good ending as canon. Conduits have not disappeared entirely, and the US has now classified every last one of them as bioterrorists, creating the Department for Unified Protection, or DUP for short. This agency has a firm grip on the city, but the game's story begins not too far away from it. We're introduced to Delson Rowe, voiced by the now well-known Troy Baker. A DUP truck carrying 3 captive conduits crashes nearby, and Rowe receives his powers from the convict Hank, who inadvertently activates his conduit abilities, opening up with smoke. Delson's older brother, a police officer named Reggie, is initially concerned about what could come of them both, but he eventually accepts the change and assists him throughout the game. With these two characters in place, Second Son aims to create a more family-focused affair, but having Delson and Reggie as brothers doesn't automatically form a connection between them and the player. The two men come from the fictional Akomish Native American reservation, but this background is only a surface-level catalyst to fuel the game's prologue, rather than a cohesive part of the narrative. Once we witness the consequences of our actions on said tribe, Delson and Reggie set off for the city, intent on tearing down the DUP's hold and getting back at their leader, Augustine, voiced by Christine Dunford. She's an individual who rose to power by compelling the government to allow superpowered individuals into the military, convincing them that it's the only option to combat the re-emergence of conduits. Notably, when we first stumble across her, the cinematic camera is angled upwards, with her concrete power symbolising the organisation's oppressive ways. An urban rebellion ensues, and this becomes the driving force behind Second Son's refined design template. Arriving in the Western American city, Infamous Second Son immediately makes its graphical style known. It's going for a more realistic look, with a detailed recreation of landmarks like the Space Needle and the Seattle Fish Market, to name a few. Delson is an outsider in this environment, a delinquent punk in the eyes of those in charge, and this is reflected in the game's side activities. It's not about clearing gangs out of districts across the map. Instead, we're now gradually eroding the DUP's control over each part of the 2 islands. Every aspect of the world, minus the returning karma activities, contributes to lowering a percentage, destroying drones and collecting their blast shards, expressing Delson's good or evil side with stencil art. They probably steered clear of the word graffiti, and destroying surveillance equipment. It's all very much like 2009's Red Faction Guerrilla. Some activities are more engaging than others though. While the stencil art does look great on screen, using the PS4 controller's motion functionality with no way of turning it off feels a bit gimmicky, bringing back memories of the PS3's forced 6-axis function. Other features fare better though. The use of the controller's touchpad and microphone for interacting with the world and changing powers are both very well integrated. You work your way through the side activities to unlock a district showdown, take down the oncoming forces that come running, then you move on to the next one. On the one hand, this new design continues to make everything you do tie into the game world well, but on the other, it gets a bit repetitive after a while. No matter which district you're in, you'll still be shooting down drones and tackling enemy bases all the way to the game's conclusion. The variation, particularly with more unique events, has been cut down somewhat, leaving the main missions to pick up the slack. The primary objectives of said content fall in line with their respective story sequences. For the first time in the series, we play out the journey Delson and his brother take to get to Seattle. In Parting of the Ways, the final mission in the prologue section, the duo come across the damage caused by the escaped conduits. This serves a means for Delson to get accustomed to his powers, while also foreshadowing the characters who will make an appearance. This is followed up afterwards by the Gauntlet, in which Delson climbs the Seattle Space Needle, which also serves a solid introduction to the city when viewed at a high altitude. You're then free to target DUP strongholds and clear out each district in any order you see fit. As a side note, I also purchased the Cole's Legacy DLC, which loosely follows on from the previous protagonist's sacrifice. In this brief set of missions, we collaborate with Dr. Wolf's brother Raymond, and later Zeke makes an appearance. The two characters continue to investigate the return of conduits and the DUP's interference, while also filling new players in on previous events. It's not a revelatory contribution to the story here, but it's nice to have considering the distance between the two games. Though there is a missed opportunity to reincorporate a new ability or two to Delson's arsenal, Perhaps Raymond Wolf could have pointed the way to a hidden core relay to sweeten the deal. In the meantime, you'll be wowed by the game's technical presentation. Sucker Punch knew exactly how to leverage the PlayStation 4's power to create a stunning environment. During hardware development, Sucker Punch played a close role in giving feedback to Sony, describing how much power they would need to deliver their vision. It clearly shows in the finished product, with the lighting being its greatest success, alongside the powers and the effect they have being beautifully presented. And just like every other game in the series, the soundtrack feels weighty and engaging thanks to a heavier focus on guitars. Enjoy Your Power is a departure from being a hero is optional, and from a gameplay standpoint, InFamous Second Son seeks to smooth out the action, moving it away from a rigid over-the-shoulder perspective and into a more free-flowing action shooter. For both combat and platforming, it succeeds quite well at this. You unlock powers very quickly once you get into the game's 4 types, with Delson absorbing them from DUP core relays. One cheesy grin and a quick flash later, and the power is immediately at your disposal. The game's smoke powers make for a solid starting point, a simple stream of shots that quickly extends into other abilities. The Cinder Blast is especially effective, unleashing a shotgun to hit multiple enemies at once. There is one gap at the start of the game, and it's the basic climbing. Delson can parkour up buildings like before, but due to somewhat fiddly controls and a reliance on more realistic animations, this gameplay facet isn't as satisfying as before. Though once you unlock other traversal moves, this fault can be put aside, with the smoke powers allowing Delson to instantly travel through vents and use a far more useful card jump. The gameplay is rounded off by a simple 3-hit melee combo that's normally enough to take out most enemies, and the new Karma Bomb abilities, an evolution of the Ionic powers from Infamous 2. But unlike that game, you have access to all 4 regardless of your karmic state, and better yet, they adapt depending on which playthrough you're undertaking. For example, Orbital Drop, which sees Delson launch himself before smashing the ground, will either subdue or kill depending on karma. Because of these changes, all 3 of these bombs always feel brilliant to use, and can be earned by performing the appropriate karmic act for good or evil. Having enemies surrender in this game reduces the need to be precise, while also evolving the touch actions from previous entries. The same focus also applies to the upgrade system, which rely on the collectible blast shards. Once again, the good and evil pathways home in on precision and chaos, this time rebranded under Subdue and Obliterate respectively. It's a shame there aren't any unique powers under good and evil runs this time around, but all told, the 4 powers combined make for the best variation in the series, as they shift the pacing of combat and traversal far more than any other release. Smoke and Neon favour a fast assault, while Video and Concrete are more slow and powerful. With Neon you can move in, quickly hit a few weak points, then immediately flee the area to regenerate your health and cover. On top of all this, it's very intuitive to change between them, as Delson draws each power from its respective source, all of which are communicated to the player visually. If you feel like switching to Neon, you need only glance towards the bright signs in the environment, for example. The abilities also influence Delson's platforming and melee moves, with Video offering a weighty twin blade attack and a glide move that can massively extend your jumps in the latter half of the game. Personally though, I prefer the Neon Dash, an infinitely useful ability that allows Delson to run up the side of buildings incredibly quickly without using up your power meter. It's definitely the best gameplay system in the franchise, and you're also given a larger ammunition pool to really go to town on your foes. Its only gap, however, is the more limited enemy design. For the most part, you'll be fighting DUP troops throughout the game who drive around in the same transports and use similar weapons and concrete powers to attack Delson, outside of their own conduits who have a few extra abilities thrown in. Once you reach the second half of the game, they do start armouring up and adding more lumbering powered suits, but they don't switch up the pace all that much, outside of the moments where attack helicopters enter the fray. Playing on normal, you'll die a lot more to auto turrets and bulky chain gun users than you will from the regular foes. They also like to jump around a lot, very much like the ice soldiers back in Infamous 2. It would have been interesting to see how the DUP started augmenting their soldiers, adding further dimension to the story, but from a gameplay standpoint they're merely acceptable as an adversary. Not quite as impressive, however, is the returning karma system. I really appreciated how it was conveyed in-game, with Delson's jacket inching towards either a blue dove or red crow depending on your choices, but its overall implementation falls short. With a new generation and upgraded hardware, now was surely the time to push the boat out on the franchise's morality system. A neutral pathway or a deeper difference between good and evil playthroughs would have been a great step forward for the series. Infamous 1 used side quests specifically tailored towards good or evil playthroughs, and 2 started pulling these karmic moments into the main missions while proceeding along the same pathway. You were playing the same story, but influencing how Cole made his way through it. What makes Second Son's karma system outdated is how it mostly sticks to its predecessors without making its effect on the campaign more impactful. Following the likes of CD Projekt's The Witcher 2 Assassins of Kings and Telltale's The Walking Dead, binary morality systems were on their way out, and with the increased console power, there was room for big improvements. The former in particular featured 2 completely different directions for Geralt to take, depending on if he goes with Vernon Roche or Yorveth at the end of the first act. The first choice Delson makes is the biggest case of missed potential. He can either selflessly reveal his powers to Augustine, or throw his local tribe under the bus instead. With the enemy being aware or unaware of Delson's powers, the game could have branched off in 2 different directions, with differing missions for each. It would have made up for the binary system that has existed since the franchise's debut, while upgrading it for new hardware. As it stands, Second Son sticks to upping the number of karma levels to 5 instead, which fits in well with the upgrade system but doesn't go beyond that. The game also dilutes its choices down to a simple push of the triggers, rather than merging them with gameplay. It's not just the main story that suffers, however. The side activities within the world are carried over verbatim from Infamous 2. That means healing the same citizens and wiping out the same protests you did before, with no variation to their layout. Because the game no longer relies on experience points, they also become irrelevant once Delson maxes out his karma rank. Adding extra detail to these random events would have made Seattle feel more alive. In a year when open world games were stagnating a fair bit, it's a shame Second Son couldn't go further in this regard. When talking about the story, many critiques of the title, be they mainstream or fans, point out that they couldn't connect with Delson the same way they did with Cole. Why is this? In my view, it's down to the more simplistic narrative and the motives of the characters. The story is very straightforward from the moment Delson and Augustine first meet. She hurt his extended family and he wants revenge, his newly acquired powers firmly tying into the protagonist's main goal. It's another instance where a push for realism ends up detracting from the game overall. Delson, and his brother Reggie for that matter, needed a more personal reason for going after the DUP, but it never arrives. Perhaps some additional material involving the Akomish tribe could have created a stronger agency for both of them. By contrast to the first 2 games where the events Cole took part in decided the fate of an entire populace, Second Son isn't as impactful. In previous games it made for high stakes, while also making Cole's choices mean more to the bigger picture. In Seattle, however, the citizens have no business with Delson's crusade. In fact, if he hadn't come to the city in the first place, life would have gone on as normal for all regular humans there. The choices Delson makes are present, but their overall effect isn't as engaging, something that's further emphasised with how the game explains the choices before you make them. On top of this, you don't really get the sense that the character we control is changing throughout the game. He maintains the same rebellious persona with little variation. It's only at the game's conclusion when we see a concrete shift towards light or dark. As with many of the story-heavy PS4 games, I don't fault the voice actors, but they needed a broader range of material here. One memorable moment occurs when Reggie dresses up as a conduit and goes all goofy to bait a rival out into the open, a point of personality that isn't replicated for most of the game. Ironically enough, it's the side characters Delson encounters that make a greater impression on the player, who also undergo the greater change as the protagonist compels them to lean towards one side or the other. Three conduits set Second Son's events into motion, and the first to be introduced is easily the best supporting individual of the bunch. Abigail Walker, better known as Fetch, voiced by Laura Bailey, sports a striking pink hairstyle, an elusive backstory, and most importantly of all, a set of neon powers that are just as awesome to look at as they are to use. You'll have to beat these conduits into submission first, and this results in some of the more unique encounters in the game. After some build-up involving some truly exquisite lighting sequences, you'll corner Fetch in a warehouse. She dashes around a tightly knit area, peppering Delson with neon attacks, with much of her challenge stemming from the speed she moves around the environment. This arena will go on to play a major role in InFamous First Light, though for now you're taking on a more unique boss fight, draining the neon signs to weaken Fetch first and unleashing a new attack. Shortly afterwards, you're given a choice between missions. Either you can destroy the drug dealer's supply, or in my case, slaughter every criminal you come across, and Fetch responds either virtuously or callously. Later on in the game, you'll encounter Eugene, a nerdy and anxious outcast whose powers manifest themselves in his video game fantasies. While searching the kid's hideout, Delson is pulled into a dazzling imaginary environment that may well be the most visually impressive moment of the entire series. The glow of the flying enemies, the might of the god leading the charge, and the fire below all make for a thrilling set piece. It reminded me of the battle with Clockwork at the end of the original Sly Cooper. Delson pulls these two individuals out of their hazy stupor and brings them on side either by redeeming or corrupting them, which influences the type of missions you can take them on. This element of the choice system also had potential. Though it does manifest itself in the returning good and evil missions, the way I drove these conduits towards chaos wasn't really felt in the story. It brings back the problem of InFamous 2, in which characters are off-screen for some time and don't feel fully cohesive to the plot. It's a shame too, because Fetch and Eugene have well-defined characteristics and backstories that reflect the origins of their powers. The system of districts also makes for an easily trackable system of progress. Once you fight your way across the bridge to the second island, you know that you're reaching the halfway point in the game. This is also the point where Augustine returns to harass Delson, throwing a larger mini-boss enemy at him. This is one moment that demonstrates her weakness as an antagonist. By having others do her dirty work for her and rarely appearing in the plot, she sticks out as one of the weakest villains in the series. Once you've tamed the wild Valkyries of Eugene's video game world, the ending isn't too far away. Hank's reappearance this late in the game doesn't contribute much to the narrative. He merely forges a partnership with Delson to break into the DUP's offshore base, only to betray him. Later on, when Delson catches up with the conduit, there's another moral choice. You can either let Hank go or murder him for his actions. Unfortunately, the game sees fit to throw in the fact that Hank has a daughter at the last minute in a shallow attempt to deepen the moment. It's an effort to draw some kind of parallel with Cole and Reggie under a familial connection, but considering how Hank's role in the story is so minuscule, this moment rings hollow. Then there's the twist. InFamous 1 had Kessler's true identity, 2 had the beast revealed as John, and finally InFamous Second Son sees Delson's brother killed by Augustine at the last moment as they attempt to knock out their offshore base. It's an effort to recapture the tragedy of Trish's death in the first game, but not executed nearly as well. Its predictable nature only scratches the surface. While Trish could have had more appearances, the bond between her and Cole was still felt, making her murder more impactful. InFamous Second Son doesn't do that, and the brothers never feel all that close throughout the game. Reggie's position as a cop should have made him a watcher on Delson's shoulder, commenting on his path towards good or evil. What tanked the scene for me was the lack of different responses. Reggie tells Delson he's proud of him before falling to his death, and yet I'd spent the whole game racking up evil karma. There needed to be an alternate line or two based on the player's choices, and the way Second Son goes back on this element is a letdown. In hindsight though, it's possible this may have stretched development costs by having to reanimate and re-record alternate sequences. Be that as it may, The game dives headlong into the finale, which looks to recreate the tower climb in the first game. Fetch and Eugene pop up again to aid Delson in his ascent, and while the jumps you're expected to make are very strict, the moment is still felt thanks to the dazzling pyrotechnics on display. Taking on Augustine at the summit also offers a neat twist. At first, she seems unbeatable, but once Delson absorbs her concrete powers, it's a solid battle. You're effectively acting just as she does, fighting fire with fire and dodging her many attacks. It's also revealed that Augustine started the DUP in a bid to protect conduits, to induct them into her organisation so they wouldn't be hunted down by the American government. Once again, this shift would have had more weight if the pieces of the puzzle had been laid down previously. In short, the villain is defeated and the characters go their separate ways. Though, for the only time in the series, the diverging final missions require good or evil karma, so no turning back at the last minute. If playing under good karma, Delson exposes Augustine's crimes and brings peace between humans and conduits, painting a memorial to his brother back at the reservation. In the evil ending I got, Delson is thrown out of the tribe for his disgraceful actions, and he callously destroys the reservation, presumably continuing his rampage across the United States shortly afterwards. This would be an impactful conclusion if the protagonist's extended family had been more developed, but as it stands like the rest of the story, it falls short of the franchise's pedigree. It's also rather similar to the evil ending in InFamous 2, as Delson effectively becomes a new beast, continuing to corrupt other conduits and grow his own power. Both endings are fitting enough for the protagonist, but they lack the depth and investment that made the first two games more memorable. In fact, that's something that can be said for much of InFamous Second Son. It's another relatively safe sequel that spoke to the 8th generation's initially tepid offering. Delson's story ended here, but Sucker Punch had one more release up their sleeve to cap off the franchise. The 5th and final entry in this retrospective is another standalone expansion, and the only game on the list that puts us in the perspective of another protagonist. Fetch's story laid out in InFamous Second Son was definitely a grueling one, as she suffered under Augustine and the DUP's experiments, and InFamous First Light is a prequel, showing how she came to Seattle and the personal growth that ensued. Frankly, it's a shame there wasn't more DLC putting Eugene and Hank in the spotlights. As characters who both set Second Son into motion, they felt a bit underused. A further 2 expansions could have put them both in the spotlights, providing further depth to their characters and the world as a whole. For what it is, First Light is a decent piece of side content and far better than Festival of Blood, but it doesn't quite manage to rectify the faults of the base game. Once again, the karma system is removed, though this time it's in favour of something more ambiguous. Fetch tells her story under Augustine's custody, and as we return to Seattle, we see the protagonist and her brother Brent living on the streets. The two have been very close for several years, and as outcasts due to being conduits, their plan to escape the city before the DUP arrives goes awry when the police arrest Brent. Fetch finds herself creating trouble for both the police and local gangs as she attempts to rescue him. Of course, anyone who played Second Son knows what becomes of them both, but the story in First Light is still able to make an impression thanks to its more contained nature and the performance of its lead voice actress. Taking place over one half of the base game's environment, Abigail Walker finds herself teaming up with the local boss Shane, who secretly plans to use her in furthering his own criminal efforts. Using purely neon powers, the expansion's finest aspect is its rapid traversal system. The sheer speed at which you can power around the environments is exhilarating, and because you have instant access to unlimited sprint, you can easily pick up all the collectibles within an hour or so. These floating red orbs encourage you to climb buildings and launch off the map, slowly upgrading Fetch's abilities as you go. The game also does a good job of setting her powers apart from Delson's. Precision makes a return, as the game slows time for you to target weak points, and later on the rocket and stasis bubbles open up more options in tackling enemies. Strangely though, I found the hand-to-hand combat the most gratifying, as Fetch lays on a flurry of punches to build up instant takedowns with a press of triangle. The combat is still enjoyable here, but First Light's position as a prequel also leaves it open to weaker enemies and an altogether easier difficulty. Taking on basic gang members isn't all that challenging, and while the DUP is added later, I never died once in my brief playthrough, which speaks to the more subdued nature of the DLC. The same is also true of the mission design, which sometimes relies on fairly generic templates. You'll be defending a truck from oncoming threats and perching on a rooftop for brief sniper turret sequences at several points. There are some unique elements to be found, with one highlight being scanning various CCTV cameras to track down missing civilians, something that challenges the player's perception as well as their combat skills. The most unique features of First Light, however, are its challenge and arena systems, the latter of which ties in with Fetch's incarceration. Augustine puts her in a training zone to test her abilities, which we return to at 3 separate intervals. These sequences eventually give way to persistent challenges, allowing the player to rack up high scores for a worldwide ranking system. From a story perspective, these moments do add some light detail to Augustine's motives, even if they don't deepen her character overall. Notably, the collectibles in the game world are not enough to fully upgrade the protagonist, so you'll have to invest some time in this alternate mode to achieve full completion. It's ironic then that Fetch's narrative arc offers a more compelling and well-realised depth than Delsin's, and it did so without the franchise's morality system. She turns against the drugs in the final act by destroying Shane's supply trucks, taunting him every step of the way. What we have is a successful reversal, as the protagonist reaches the height of her powers. She also rises above her previously vulnerable nature. Blowing up the trucks you were riding on top of previously is a great way of sticking it to Shane. But in a well-executed twist, she hurries to rescue her brother, only to be drugged by the crime boss and forced to confront her inner demons head-on. In a haze of colour and images, we see how the protagonist's parents threw her out, causing the two siblings to spiral downwards. In effect, she's fighting off her addiction here, running from its efforts to entrap her. This emotional climax ends in tragedy as Fetch accidentally kills her brother in the ensuing chaos. Thanks to Laura Bailey's stellar performance, we're able to empathise with her loss, and as the DUP hauls her off to their secret training camp, the final showdown begins. Augustine's last ingredient towards maximising Fetch's powers is to bring Shane in, bringing her rage to a fever pitch. The pursuit for revenge heads out into the snowy mountains, and while its final moments do drag a bit with a slow walking section, the sense of speed soon returns as our heroine fights her way through the DUP forces. With Shane cornered on the edge, we get another strong example of contextual gameplay as he's blown to pieces. While he wasn't the deepest of antagonists, the final flourish of the InFamous series is a cathartic one. As the soldiers once again detain Fetch and put her in a truck with two familiar faces, we know exactly where we're going. By offering a satisfying dose of revenge and bringing things full circle, First Light comes to a ceremonious close, and Sucker Punch's longest-running franchise bows out with class. It may not have been the best entry in the series, but it was a thrilling ride while it lasted. The InFamous formula endured for a while, even if they weren't industry-defining masterpieces. InFamous 1 laid the groundwork incredibly well, 2 did its best to expand, and Second Son settled in place, focusing more on upping its fidelity and flow. Finally, the DLC packs offered alternate takes on the franchise that stuck close to their bigger brothers. After the Second Son two-parter, Sucker Punch shut itself away for a while, slowly yet diligently putting together their next big project. They like to take their time, and that's one of their best characteristics as a developer. When they take on a project, they commit with a laser focus, revealing details and gameplay only when necessary, without going overboard on the promises. There's a lot of excitement for Ghost of Tsushima right now, and although it's looking to be another third-person story-heavy game for the PS4, the title looks set to send the console off with a bang. They say our choices make us, and Sucker Punch Productions has certainly shown this throughout their consistently solid output, something that will follow wherever the PlayStation brand goes. Thanks for watching. Going back through the InFamous franchise was an enjoyable and entertaining ride all the way through, and as Sucker Punch commences a new series, there's a couple of PlayStation YouTubers I'll point out. First up is Robin Gaming, a passionate fan of the brand who has some deep discussions. Then there's Mystic, a chap who brilliantly breaks down PlayStation's long-forgotten features. Finally, if you're looking for something goofier, Cad Icarus is the one to watch, with a ton of wacky videos across all 4 console generations. Thanks again, and have a great day.